Okay, brilliant. Welcome along, everyone. We've got quite a few participants joining us now. We're just going to touch on soil health with Nicole Masters. Nicole is a soil ecologist, would you say, Nicole?
Agroecologist.
Agroecologist, hailing from New Zealand. Hailing from New Zealand, but now in the States. Whereabouts did you say? Up in Idaho, up on the range.
Idaho. Yeah.
And she is an absolute legend when it comes to soil health, particularly around regenerative agriculture and regenerative systems. And I met her back in New Zealand when I attended one of her workshops a year or so ago when I was managing Mungaroa Station. And yeah, a lot of things clicked for me at that workshop, and yeah, I was very impressed. And I've also got her book, which I highly recommend. If
oh, very good. Very good.
A few bookmarks in there. Yeah, so I would definitely highly recommend that, because it's a lot. It sort of applies a lot of the technical knowledge to what we sort of know anecdotally as farmers. So yeah, I'm very aware of time, so we'll go straight into it. Nicole.
Right. Thanks, Tim. Thanks to the PFLA team. You'll notice there's a Q&A button down the bottom. You're welcome to ask questions as we go. There's also a chat. So if you wanted to enter in the chat maybe where you're from, that would be kind of neat, so we can kind of see where people are from. But yeah, I'll kick things off. Thanks for the introduction, Tim. I appreciate it. Yeah, so as you can hear, New Zealand accent, but these days I do spend most of my time in the US. My company, Integrity Soils, we are currently working with producers that cover just over 1.2 million acres in New Zealand, Australia, the US, and Canada. And wherever I go, it's very interesting, because you'll hear people say, well, that's all very well that it works in Western Australia, they've got it easy, or it's all very well that it works in New Zealand in terms of building soil health, but it's much harder where we are. So wherever I go, it seems to be that people feel that their particular situations are some of the hardest. And that's why traveling is really good, because it gives you a little bit of perspective about what's going on. So what I want to do in this session really is dig into what does it even mean to regenerate systems, looking at some case studies, and then really what my internal process is. So in the book, I really dig into, when I'm working on a piece of land, what is my internal thinking? How do I triage or look for what's putting a drag on production, or limiting the ability to build soil carbon, water holding capacity, all the rest. So as these questions come in, Tim, I don't know if there's something that you see that maybe you can say, oh, actually there's a question, feel free to interrupt me, that's fine.
Yeah, brilliant.
Why do we even need to regenerate? And some of the statistics and what's happening in the UK, and I'll admit that I have not been to the UK yet. I'd love to, obviously I've got a bit of English blood, as most New Zealanders do. But yes, the situation that's happening in the UK is very similar to the situation in New Zealand and what's happening globally. So you guys lose 235,000 tons of nitrogen, just over 8,000 tons of phosphorus, are lost to the environment. So generally that's in water into the UK. You guys have lost 84% of your fertile topsoil since 1850. 84%. I mean, that's just dramatic. And you're losing about 1 to 3 centimeters of soil a year. And this is very much reflected in what we're seeing in New Zealand, except this started probably in the 1950s. Damaged soils, they've calculated, contribute about 233 million pounds a year in terms of flooding events. So events like this are not natural events, and what we're seeing globally is flash floods, drought, and this is because of how we've been managing our soil. So the cost of soil degradation in England and Wales is around 1.2 billion pounds. And this is due to the loss of organic content in soils, compaction, and erosion. Yeah, and these kinds of soil losses. So we're going to talk about how do we actually halt soil losses and how do we actually turn our system that's from degenerative into regenerative. So what does it mean to be a regenerative farmer? So regenerative farming really involves a complex learning system. It's not about substituting, adding some kind of product in, it's a whole system. And it's how do we apply this in our local context. So the foundation of the pyramid for regenerative is really education and observations and how we build our understanding of what's happening in our own local context. And farmers are the experts. And so this definition was taken from an agroecology paper that was written in 2007, where they were looking at what was involved in these farmers that really are building soil health. You see management is the next one up in that tier, and management really underpins everything that we're doing. So if I'm talking about something and maybe we're using an input, management is still your number one key. If you don't want to manage well, that's fine, but you're going to have to spend some money if you want to regenerate, right? And then we look at addressing our limiting factors, and I'm going to talk about those, building biodiversity into the system, feeding microbiology, and maybe we require some kind of broad spectrum fertilizers or refinements, right? But what underpins all of this is the mindset. And what was interesting for me during the writing process was just really seeing how a regenerative mindset shifts what becomes, you know, what might have been considered a challenge or an obstacle to something that's really an opportunity. So instead of looking at weeds and diseases in terms of how do I kill it, what spray do I need, it becomes what is this trying to indicate and how can I do this particular weed out of a job, for instance. So seeing things as opportunities, seeing them as indicators is very much the mindset of regenerative. And so I've really noticed, and there are papers out on this, about there's a change in well-being and a decrease in stress when we start to regenerate our environment and start to look at soils and pastures differently. So in the literature, regenerative ag is defined as any system of food or fiber with these objectives. So how do we incorporate natural processes into agricultural production so that we ensure we are profitable, we're efficient, and we're producing quality food? So if you're not profitable, you're not regenerating. If you're spending a lot of time racing around and having no time, you're not regenerating in yourself. If you're producing a pretty low quality food product, you're not regenerating, right? We find a reduced need for inputs. So there's a reduction in the external, harmful, or non-renewable inputs with more targeted use of what inputs you are using with the aim, ideally, of reducing costs. And so I think we work with about 250,000 acres of cropping, and this has been our finding through the whole thing, that there's so many of our inputs are incredibly inefficient in the, I don't know if we want to call it the industrial food model or the conventional food model. And there's ways that we can eradicate those inefficiencies. And producers really are the experts. So this has been driven from the ground up. Producers that I've been working with or friends with for over 20 years, it's them that hold all this information. I'm not picking this stuff up from university or necessarily in the literature. It's happening on the ground with producers. So it takes the full participation of people in the rural community in finding solutions. So regenerative agriculture is driven by principles rather than practices. So if you were to compare organic, for instance, to be organic, you have to follow a series of practices, all right? So those practices will be not using chemicals, for instance, is a practice, whereas this is a principle. So you can be organic regenerative by not using chemicals, but by optimizing plant bricks or photosynthesis. So we look at how do we support optimal plant health, so we're capturing as much sunlight energy as possible. Making sure we have year-round ground cover, which for many of you in the UK, that shouldn't be a problem. It's not like we have environments like where I am in Idaho, where we have a lot of bare ground. Are we going to reduce or are we going to optimize disturbance? So disturbance events can be natural events such as fire or even waterlogging. It can be pesticides, fungicides, herbicides. Cultivation obviously is a really big disturbance. And animals really are, there is a temporal disturbance. How do we optimize that disturbance to awaken and enliven soils? We want to look at increasing diversity. So that's above and below ground and biomass of plants, root systems, and microbiology. and then taking action on those enabling factors, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But really, if we follow these principles, we start to see systems that come back to life. And at the end of the day, regenerative agriculture is very much about what are these outcomes. So the outcomes should be an increase in biodiversity, so above and below ground, an improvement in water quality, that our soil health measures are improving, our greenhouse gas emissions are reducing, so that we can actually, some operations are able to say that they are net greenhouse gas sinks, that we're improving the quality of the food, and we're also producing nil residue crops, hopefully, and that profitability and wellness and those social outcomes are on the improve, right? So we're seeing a massive blow up in regenerative in the last few years, which is very, very exciting. Just to mention a couple projects, so New Zealand Merino have just put a proposal together for a regenerative certification, and 30% of New Zealand Merino producers signed up for this program, which is very exciting. The VF Corporation, so these guys own Patagonia and Icebreaker and Timberland and North Face and all this, are looking at sourcing regenerative wool products or regenerative products that they can, you know, that might be cotton or whatever, that are improving outcomes for the environment, and they've just been incredible leaders in this space. A program called Restore Australia has just had 40 million acres in Queensland sign up to start regenerating landscapes. And then we've got big companies like Danone, General Mills, all these ones, including Disney, getting connected with producers in terms of how do we produce the best quality food that actually we know is truly sustainable in terms of we could be farming in this way for thousands of years. We're also seeing carbon projects, so the Australian Soil Carbon Project. Native Energy is paying farmers here in Montana. Indigo Ag with the Teraton Initiative. We're seeing projects like this popping up all over the place. It's actually paying farmers directly for carbon sequestration. So when I look at a system, I have a process that I call the 5 M's. So what is putting a drag on your production business? Is it a microbial problem? Is it a mineral problem? Is it low organic matter? Is it management? And is it mindset? And what we often find is, if you're not sure if it's you, it's probably you. That could be one of the biggest things putting a drag on your system. But yeah, these are the processes that I look at in terms of whatever's limiting our success in terms of having, you know, pest, weed free, optimal animal health. Which of these 5 things is feeding into that and that we can optimize? So we look at identifying what we call the enabling factors. So is that plant photosynthesizing as well as it could? Because that is what is pumping and driving the whole system below and above ground. What's happening with air movement? So we think about it in terms of the same as the human body, like how long can you survive without air? Maybe 3 minutes. How long without water? Maybe 3 days. How long without food? You know, 3 weeks, for instance. So the same thing works in soil. If we have a soil that's very, very compacted and has limited air movement, that's going to be the first place that we look at. And I suspect, without knowing, but knowing that you guys have, you know, a lot of clay soils, pretty intensive agriculture. We have, I imagine, manure that's going out. That air movement is probably your #1 factor to look at. And then, you know, what's happening with water. So if air's not working, then water's not going to be working. So if I work on a property and actually airflow is working really well, but there's a problem with water, then we get really curious about why is water not infiltrating? Why have we got water sitting on the surface? And then maybe your water cycle is working really well. Then what's happening with decomposition? Is manure breaking down in a few weeks? Do we see that disappearing out of the system? And then we look at our minerals, as opposed to conventional agronomy, which is going to look at step 5 as #1. What can you buy in a bag? So why is sunlight capture so important? So you probably remember this from when you were like, I don't know, when you're 15 and learning about photosynthesis, and you're like, what does this have to do with my life? Everything, all right? So the plant draws in carbon dioxide and water through the magic of photosynthesis reacting with light. The plant produces sugars and releases oxygen. So that production of sugar then turns into everything in the plant, from lignin to cellulose, proteins, fats. Sugar is the building block for life, and it's the currency that makes the planet turn, all right? So those byproducts of sugar are very important, and they're going to be allocated to different parts, so either to grow leaves or to grow roots, or some of it actually gets sent down through the root system to stimulate microbiology, right? So when I think about carbon, I think about it in terms of these two main cycles, and they're actually connected, so they're not disparate, but that short cycle, so that's things like manure and urine and plant roots and compost or whatever, is what I call the I'm here for a good time, not a long time honey cycle, right? Very important. It's what's causing respiration and drawdown and in and out in the day. So all throughout the day, that soil is basically breathing in and out, right? Very important, stimulating microbiology. But the second part is the deep carbon pathway, or what Dr. Christine Jones calls the liquid carbon pathway, which is sugars, which is, you know, it depends on the type of plant, but it could be as high as 60% of the sugars that plant has got from photosynthesis, it pumps down through its roots. And it does that in relationship with your mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae is a type of fungus that lives in and on plant roots. It takes those sugars out deep into the soil and exchanges that for minerals and water, which it brings back to the plant, right? So this flow is happening all the time, where basically the plant says, hey, you know, I feel like Italian for dinner. I'm going to send out a signal that says, can I have Italian? I want some pizza. I don't know. And it sends that signal out through the mycorrhizae, and it pays for that pizza using the sugars that it's got from photosynthesis or that carbon. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, right? And it pumps that out through that mycorrhizae, and then that mycorrhizae brings back pizza or zinc or phosphorus or whatever it is that that plant needs to support itself optimally, all right? So if we're talking about how do we maximize carbon sequestration or drawdown, we do that through this process, this second process, and it's deeper, all right? So we're looking more to that 40 centimeters to a meter depth, where it's really pumping those sugars down. And one of the byproducts that we'll see is what we call the Rastafarian rootsman, because they look like dreadlocks here. Dig up your plant roots and have a look. Do you see these kind of systems on your plants? And what that is that's all those sugars creating this rhizosheath. So it's a zone around the plant roots where microbiology is just going nuts. They're communicating with the plant, they're protecting the plant, they're providing hormones and all sorts of stuff for optimal plant health, right? So if there's one thing after this session, so for tomorrow, go out and dig up some plants and have a look at what do your root systems look like. So really our job is to, how do we take soil that might be from like a sand, silt and clay, not a lot of biological activity, capture sunlight energy, and then turn that into those kind of soil systems, right? You see that picture there. When this farmer started originally, his rooting systems were only going down between 1 inch to 2 inches. Sorry, I've been in America for too long. Let's say 5 to 10 centimeters. No, 2.5 to 5 centimeters depth of roots. And now within 4 years time, this is what his rooting systems look like, right? And I suspect if many of you dig up your plant roots, you're going to find they're very shallow, and you got to get curious. Why are my root systems not down deeper, and why are they not covered in soil? So yeah, looking at breath. So how long can we survive without air? Not long. So this example here is from an orchard that that I was good friends with and was working on in 2006, which is when this research was done. The property on the left is an integrated pest management. It belonged to the research station, so best management practices. So what are we going to do? We're going to mow it really low. We're going to have herbicide strips, and because of that, they now need to irrigate, so they're having to put water on. My friend Nick on the right-hand side, he has permanent pastures. He's not irrigating because he doesn't need to. And he was applying compost. So the difference between, oh, that's in pounds, so that's not very helpful. Anyway, there was a significant difference in the amount of carbon that he was sequestering beyond the additions of compost. Now, what I want to look at this is it's a spectrometer. What it is it's basically taking X-ray images of the pore spaces in the soil. So the one on the left is the integrated pest management. The one on the right is the regenerative. So what they've done is they've basically X-rayed like a 10 centimeter core, and they're looking at how much airspace is in that soil. So what they found is the one on the left, there wasn't a lot of connection. The one on the right, 78% of that soil was made of air and was connected. So there was more air in his soil, or more pore spaces and empty spaces than there was soil. So what that means is that he has a better buffer for nutrients and can filter contaminants and better water holding capacity. So these soils could take up to 18 inches, 450 millimeters of rain in an hour, or moisture in an hour. That whole soil is functioning like a sponge. So when you look at the one on the left, this is our flash flood drought. Flash flood drought. Do you feel like your soils are getting drowsier? Like suddenly do you have too much water at some times of the year and not enough at other times? This is potentially what your soil looks like, is the one on the left. The one on the right, that holds soil like a sponge and then slowly releases moisture over time. So they looked at the total connectivity and the integrated pest managed property, and they found this. And what you'll find is it's probably going to be something like a grasshopper or a cicada or some kind of root grub, something that's chewing on roots. All right, that's what's made that burrow. What we find is as soils become less biologically diverse and more compacted, is it provides the perfect conditions for these insect pests. All right, so if you have a lot of root chewing insects, or ones that, like if you think of cicadas and grasshoppers, you know, they're spending 8 to 12 years under the ground, and then the perfect conditions, they'll come up. So we really want to have insect suppressive soils. Whereas this one, the regenerative, so it wasn't 78, 79% of that total area is connected, and it's all about worms and microbiology moving through that soil and creating a structure that now we have no limitation for air and water movement. I just think it was a really cool study, all right? So you want to look at which of the 5 M's. Is it your minerals, your microbes, low organic matter, your management, or your mindset that's limiting airflow on your farm? Okay, so on this picture here, for them, it was management. So this is what we call the cow pan. So allowing animals to be on soils that are really wet, but also these soils are very, very high in magnesium. So those magnesium soils become very tight and sticky. So when we're addressing this soil, we're doing things to address the high magnesium and doing things to address when animals are on the ground when it's wet. And if you guys are like how I imagine, it's probably you have periods of time when you're very wet. How do we manage livestock in those conditions? So yeah, water, obviously our next one. So building that structure and all that air movement, now we can hold on to more water and we have an increased resilience to erosion. So when someone says to you, how much rainfall did you get? You want to start being able to say all of it. How effective is your rainfall? And what I find is soils that we've dug all around the place is the water cycles on nearly all the properties we go to visit, the water cycle is broken. All right, so do an infiltration test for yourself. You measure this in millimeters per minute. It's very simple and it should be quick. However, samples that we've done around New Zealand, you know, we're taking 45 minutes to over an hour to allow that 25 millimeters of water to sink in. And all you need is a piece of like PVC pipe, bang it in the ground, time an inch, and then I want you to record the 2nd and 3rd inch and then keep going. Like how many inches of water can you actually absorb in an hour, and start to benchmark that for yourself. Am I improving my water cycle or am I degenerating it? So if water takes longer than 2 millimeters a minute to absorb, your soil is in trouble. So that's about 12.5 minutes for that 25 millimeters. And if that is not infiltrating, then potentially we're losing soil, we're losing water, and we're losing production, right? We all know the value of water. So I just want to show a quick example. So Hamish Belsky, he's in the bottom of New Zealand in Southland. One of his issues or concerns, he had some pretty major insect pests. I don't know what kind of insects you guys have, but these are types of grass grubs as well as clover, weevil. His soils were hydrophobic. So what that means literally is they are afraid of water. You do not want soils that are afraid of water. And what he found was he just wasn't growing a lot. So what he did is he put in some cover crops, diverse cover crops, and his infiltration went from 40 minutes for an inch of water to 10 seconds for that first inch and 26 seconds for the second inch. So something like cover crops, if you do have these water repellent soils or you have that compaction layer, can very quickly knock that soil into being able to hold on to water and have water moving. And by having diversity in here too, immediately your insect pests go down. I mean, they really are attracted to our monocultural ryegrass, clover kind of blends. Whereas you get diversity in there, those root chewers are not going to be very happy. And yeah, obviously with some of the species, we're going to get some root penetration. I love sunflowers. If you see the root systems on a sunflower, they're just phenomenal. And obviously he's got a lot more yield than what he was growing before. So one thing I want to point to is thinking about what holds soil together. So you guys are losing a phenomenal amount of soil, either as dust or, I mean, it's certainly not like what's happening in Australia, but certainly with water. So what causes erosion like this? And so you could look at a photo like this, which is pretty horrific. It was about 40 minutes from where my farm was in New Zealand, and go, well, there hasn't really been an erosion where the trees are. So it must be trees that are holding these soils together. If you look at these faces, some of these are steeper than 1-to-1, and they were grazing cattle on there. And when we looked at the rooting systems in there, very, very shallow root system. So yes, maybe it's roots. So you guys lose 3 million tons of topsoil each year. 3 million tons, all right? It's one of your biggest exports is soil. So they did this study. This was done in the US with Heinrich Schraven. So what he did is he had 2 tables, and he placed a ram under one end to tilt the table. And on one table, he had a soil that was combined with a mix that was a compost and a compost tea that was very high in fungi. And on the right, it was the same soil, but it didn't have the special mix in it. So they lifted it up, and then they applied rainwater events, so storm events. So 3 times 10-year storm events, and then a 50-year storm event. So 5 millimeters an hour for 30 minutes, 50 millimeters an hour for 30 minutes. And then looked at what happened in terms of that soil and what happened in terms of the water quality. What they found was that treated table that had your fungal compost extract, and your compost had 98% less bare soil than table 2. They also had 32% less water runoff because that soil is absorbing that water. So it's holding onto it and then slowly releasing. And what was interesting is the water, which had a bit of chlorine, it was this town supply, that water in the bucket on table 1 was cleaner than the water that had been applied. So that soil had actually filtered it. So if you look at the Swiss government's website, they have done a lot of research into this in terms of it is fungi that hold those soils together. So fungi make the large aggregates or the crumb structure in soil, and they are what are holding the soil together. If you don't have fungi, then suddenly we have wreck and ruin, basically. Those soils just fall apart and they end up in your waterway, and we start to see the sedimentation that we're seeing in your coastal regions, all right? It's because your soils are bacterially dominated, all right? So bacteria, or if you think about soils in terms of, I think of them in terms of like gut health, all right? So 80% of plant health and nutrition is driven by biological functions, the same as it is in our own gut. So the more diversity we have in microbiology, the more biological signals, the better resilience to stress, better crop health and quality. So everything that we're doing is looking at how do we optimize microbiology and have diversity in as much biomass as possible. So thinking about bacteria, they are your oldest and simplest and most numerous organisms, are very important for disease suppression, nutrient retention, they're breaking stuff down, and they form the micro aggregates. So the very fine stuff, all right? They're putting those together and sticking them together. They're very important in the nitrogen cycle, and they break down what we call the simple sugars. So when you're thinking in terms of, like actually, if you've got experience with compost, you'll understand this better, is that it's the green stuff that creates the heat, and that heat is all bacteria, all right? So green materials, green grass, if we think of the dairy farm system in the UK, so ryegrass, clover, urine, urea, manures, all feed bacteria. And so what we see, and this is what's happening in New Zealand, is 78% of New Zealand dairy farms have significant compaction. And the reason for that is all they're doing is feeding bacteria. They make the fine microaggregates, and we see soils that start to collapse. Okay. One of the other byproducts of having a lot of bacteria in the system is they make an alkaline exudate, and basically they start to create nitrates in the system, all right? Now those will get a signal for what we call the nitrate weeds, and I'm pretty sure you guys can relate to this list. So things like your pigweed, your fat hen, so amaranthus families, nettles, thistles, nightshade, inkweed, foxtail barley grasses. These weeds are telling you that you've got nitrates in the system and your system is bacterially dominated. And I know you guys can relate to that list, I'm sure. Okay, so they are very important. However, if we have very bacterial dominated, it creates compaction, and we end up with these increases in nitrates in the plants. The other thing that can happen is, if you think about rain that's falling from the sky, what makes it rain is that 40 to 100% of all the ice crystals and rainfall contain bacteria. And one of those bacteria is called Pseudomonas syringae. It causes ice nucleation. So basically ice crystals, which is frost, right? So these organisms are directly responsible for some of your frost events. So how we can reduce frost? We're going to reduce those free nitrates. So by feeding other types of organisms in the system, lifting our bricks or our plant sugar, and increasing microbiology on those leaves and in the soil, we can fight those that's like a tongue twister, fight those frost factors. One organism that is pretty neat is called Pseudomonas fluorescens, and it eats Pseudomonas syringae, the one that forms the ice crystals. This organism eats them specifically, and it can protect, so we use this in horticulture and viticulture. It can protect from frost damage as low as -6 degrees for up to 2 months, which is pretty neat. Now, Pseudomonas fluorescens, you can buy it, but it comes out of a worm's butt. So when I started in my career, it was in vermiculture. I have a big soft spot for, compost and vermicast. So as far as I'm concerned, who's going to do it better than a worm? And what worms poop is the elixir of life, right? So it has organisms like Pseudomonas fluorescens that will eat those ice nucleating bacteria. They also eat the bacteria that make the waxy coatings. So if we have soils that are hydrophobic and water repellent, a little bit of vermicast can actually help release and stimulate microbiology that will eat those waxy coatings. So the fungi, so we kind of think in terms of biomass, that we have a bacterial population and a fungal population. Also very important, disease suppression. They retain nutrients, they're breaking stuff down. Now, they form the large soil macroaggregates. And when I talk about vermicast, this is what my vermicast look like. Very fungal dominated vermicast. It's quite tricky to do, but not really, because all I was doing was feeding white wood chips. So pretty much all your English species are in that white wood chip realm. So elm, willow, poplars, birch trees are all in the white wood category, right? And they stimulate fungi like no one else's business. So fungi are really what are holding soil together and are very important in yield. So fungi will actually get into the rock system, into rock surfaces, and release nutrients bound on rocks. So a lot of what we see in terms of conventional agriculture is we have a lot of nutrient in the system, but it's bound and it's not released. What releases it is fungi, so stimulating fungi to release them. There's also something really cool that fungi do, is they combine minerals to create rocks, like crystalline rocks. So weatherite, calcite, mullite, which is a copper rock that's made in Western Australia. The cool thing about this stuff is it's a carbon sink, and it's a permanent carbon sink. So when you're measuring carbon, for those of you that are, we're going to be looking at our inorganic carbon fraction as well. So that's the stuff that's probably historically been ignored because they're like, oh, it's rocks, we're not going to count that. You want to count it because fungi are actually contributing to this, and it's a permanent carbon sink. How cool is that? All right. So fungi to bacteria ratio. So New Mexico State University has shown that fungi to bacteria ratios are more closely related to production than NPK, right? So they had some 7-year study just using compost and compost extracts and cover crops, with cover crops grown using NPK, and they outperformed, I think, every year except the first year in terms of production. And what we find is if you have very low fungi to bacteria ratio, so a lot of bacteria in the system, we will see an increase in what we call the low quality weed species. So barley grass, wild oat, think of grasses often that you don't really want, or your thistles and species like that. They really, really enjoy your bacterially dominated soils. I'll leave that. So this is the work showing that as fungi increase, so we've got that 3.68 means we have 3.68 biomass of fungi to 1 biomass of bacteria, so very fungal dominated, as we see an increase in yield, right, compared to the bacterial. And the other cool thing is fungi make water, like literally. So when they break down organic material, so your carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, they take that carbon to form chitin in their cell walls, and then they release water. So about 20% of what they release is water. So when we're looking at dry periods, if we have good active fungi in that system, we see a slow release of water through that system. Now these guys require the more complex stuff. So for our compost, this is our brown materials. So rank, brown grass, cellulose, lignin, chitin, stubbly materials, straw. I'm a big fan of fish hydrolysate and humates. So fish hydrolysate is a more complex fish product. Has a lot more oil in it. Whereas the humates are your soft brown coals. The fungi go absolutely nuts for it. Some of you are using biochar and wood chips, right? So actually using these types of materials to stimulate your fungal populations in your soil. So we start to see soil structure building, aeration, disease suppression, right? So I just want to share a case study. So this is Lindsay Racing, based in New Zealand. They brought me in because these are some of the best soils probably in the world, just gorgeous soils. And what they'd done is the property had been rolling sheep and beef, and they wanted it flatter for racehorses. So they basically just took the tops off hills and dropped them into the gullies, and then put maybe a centimetre of soil back. And so when we arrived, what was happening with these underground rills, soil was starting to be lost as those gullies were trying to reestablish. It was basically a mess. So you can see here, there's only about a centimetre of soil back on top. All right. They were seeing other things like behavioural problems with livestock, a lot of ticks and lice on, this, it's a very prestigious stud, and yeah, the animals didn't look so good. So that's some of the visual signs. So what we did in year one is we actually came in with an aerator, so a groundhog, just to open that soil up. They had been paying to dump sawdust and manure, so we got them to start making their own compost, and we put on a liquid brew that had fish hydrolysate, and then a biocontrol for insect pests. So if you look at this picture there, that is our clover root weevil and black beetles. These guys, we calculated they were eating about 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per year. All right, so these guys, their major grazer on the property was actually these insects. All right, so entomopathogenic, what that means is it's an insect pathogen, right? So these are fungi that will infest, they live inside the plant like an endophyte, and they will infest your pest species, or the clover weevil, black beetles, ticks. So we actually put it on the horses as well for tick control, and something called mealybug. So when you dig holes, have a look for mealybug. I've seen a lot of agronomists falsely think that it's fungus. If you're seeing these sort of white fluff, or there's a lot of white material in your soil, it's probably mealybug. These guys are doing a huge amount of economic damage across the whole planet right now because plants are stressed. We're seeing mealybug pop up in all sorts of places. We also did, because it's a racing stud, I was very lucky to have a pretty good budget. So we put on gypsum, serpentine, so some magnesium, guano, humates, some cobalt, and some boron, right? Now that's not a recipe for everybody. This was just for this particular operation. And this photo is at year 3. The compost, they had different age compost, so the mature one at the front, middle, and then the new one at the back. All right, so 3 years of compost. So this is what it looked like when we started. Within about 6 to 8 months, we were seeing this. So starting to see worms coming through and mixing topsoil into that clay. And then in 22 months, we were measuring across the property the growth of about 25 millimeters of soil. So we were pretty much growing a millimeter of soil a month. So you guys are losing 1 to 3 centimeters of soil a year, maybe, hopefully not. And so we have the ability to actually build it just as quickly. So can we get that topsoil development starting to happen? So we found that their bricks, which is a measurement of photosynthesis, doubled. They'd had some big problems with sodicity. So they were actually, they didn't realize, but they'd been irrigating with brine. Which is never good. And so we dropped those sodic levels right back. We got 95% insect control, increase in yield. And what we found was animal behavior significantly changed. Like the jockeys really reported a big difference in animals not being spooky and flighty, and just, you know, how racehorses can be. But yeah, so they were pretty happy with those results. All right, so I've left enough time for us to be able to answer questions as we go. And yeah, buy my book. So yeah, if you've got some questions, then some other questions that we're not going to answer today, then I really encourage you to buy the book. Sorry, I was speaking a bit fast, thinking I was going to run out of time, but we're good, aren't we, Tim?
Yeah, no, we're good. If you want to keep going, I mean, you're providing a lot of super valuable information. So if you wanted to crack on, keep going, go for it.
I can crack on, but if we've got questions, I'd rather answer these questions.
Okay.
Do you want to read them to me?
Yeah, I will read them to you. So over here with the UK system, we tend, and also within the organic systems, like the use of cover crops as a sort of nutrient building, soil health amendment phase before you go into wheat or barley or something like that. How would you recommend terminating that crop? You know, currently it's either a plough within an organic system or Roundup.
We're seeing some pretty exciting stuff happening in terms of organic no-till, which I'm like, just is blowing my mind. Rick Clark in Indiana would be someone to have a look at what he's doing. So organic no-till, so actually crimping crops to terminate, grazing crops to terminate, especially if they're annuals. If we are using a little bit of glyphosate, then I add in a fulvic acid so that we can drop our herbicide rate and just give it and drop it right down and just give it a really light burn. And then the fulvic acid helps to increase the efficacy. And yeah, so grazing, crimping, and then looking at what kind of species are actually going to grow in response. So if we're seeing certain types of weed species, I'm a big fan of, like, I love weeds. I get really excited about them because they're telling you so much about what's happening in your soil conditions. And so if you're starting to see something that's more persistent, all right, what's that weed trying to tell you, so that we can change it either microbially or minerally, so that we don't have sort of these more pervasive weeds if you are trying to crimp and control a cover crop. But yeah, I think people are getting more innovative in their solutions.
Okay, perfect. So this is a kind of a complicated one around measuring soil carbon and soil carbon sequestration. Is there a way that we can actually quantitatively measure and monitor the increase in soil carbon or the change in soil carbon sequestration?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate and yeah, you know, it's I still feel like we haven't got a totally black and white one agreement. I like what the Australian Soil Carbon Project is doing, so making sure that you know, you're GPSing those locations, you're coming right back, you know, within a meter of where you are sampling, going down to 1 meter. You want to go deeper than just the 30 centimeters. You don't want to just be measuring that good time in a long time cycle. So yeah, I mean, I think that we're getting closer in terms of measurement. New Zealand at the moment, the government has asked for the scientists to come up with some kind of agreement so that we can actually have everyone on the same page and doing the same kind of measurements. But yes, you can do it. I would prefer to look at it in terms of ecosystem services, and I actually think that ecosystem services is going to very quickly replace these carbon markets because of the trickiness with carbon. It's almost like it moves a little like water. And so then get interested in terms of the things that align with soil carbon. So that will be like, you know, your soil nitrogen, your nutrients, your water infiltration, your bulk density, soil structure, all of these things, because they are all indicative of functional soil carbon, which is the important thing, I think, to term as well. You know, we're not talking about thatch, we're talking about carbon that's contributing to the overall health of the system. So yeah, I think ecosystem services really is the way that we're going to capture this, and we're starting to do more of those types of measurements to align, hopefully, with some of these deeper carbon measurements, and yeah, try and simplify it. Yeah, anyway, it's a big topic. Yeah, that's like a whole
yeah.
thing.
And just moving on from that, where would you sort of see the optimum sort of soil organic matter levels? Like?
Well, it's going to depend on your soil type, and probably for many of you, you're already above that 5% organic matter, which is only like 2% carbon. I don't know about the historical soil carbon levels, but if you guys have lost 84% of your fertile topsoil, then potentially you've got 84% of carbon to come back to. You know, some soils that I'm working on in New Zealand are 22% organic matter, and they are degraded. So it's, I think we're going to look at how good can we get it. The modeling, and there's a paper about to be released in New Zealand, is showing that assuming that we were saturated or that we were close to having, you know, full soils is not true. Otherwise, New Zealand soils would have a lot more carbon in them. So yeah, I think the sky's the limit. And also, we're not just talking about, you know, 20 centimeters of soil, but how deep can these soils be? You know, is your topsoil 3 or 4 feet deep? Probably not.
Good. So there's no real limitation. Just in terms of, so over here, there's a lot of animals that are housed over the winter, and there's a lot of called farmyard manure piling up in the back of sheds. How would you sort of instructions on sort of breaking that down using sort of worms and structural amendments and the timescales and things like that?
Yeah, I think if you're just stockpiling manure and then putting it on to the landscape, it's incredibly polluting, and it just seems like an absolute waste of what is a real resource. So yeah, I prefer, obviously, I put worms through manure, or we'll do some kind of, like you can do a lactic acid type treatment, some kind of biological treatment just to pre-treat it before we put it out on the ground, but it does need to be microbially processed. Otherwise, you can create obviously pollution and also really, really tight soils. So for those of you that are interested in maybe composting your manure, we had a webinar that was out just a couple of weeks ago that really went into that whole process of thinking about how to break that farmyard manure down and turn it into something that's very high value. Yeah, so I'd recommend you look at that.
Perfect. How do you go about facilitating a change in mindset?
Self? For others. So if you look in, like, I'm fascinated by the behavior change stuff, and that's certainly it's the biggest part of our business. Even with people that are already on a regenerative journey, they'll often find that they're stopped for some reason, you know. It might be something to do with family or succession, or so yeah, we do a lot of work in this space. And if you look at the behavior change science, it really says, you know, it's not data that's going to change a mindset. It is connecting emotionally with something that you really care about. So you know, when we're working one-on-one with clients, we really are looking at, you know, what is it that you really care about? What would make soil health worth investing in, or, you know, getting off the chemical treadmill? Like, what would that be like? And it's got to have a bigger reward emotionally than that sense of risk or the inertia that it takes to get over the hump to change. And so for me, and I think, you know, maybe this is one of the benefits of being a female extension agent, is really connecting with people on that emotional level about what do you care about, and what do you really want to see, and if you waved a magic wand, what would your property look like, and just really getting people connected with something bigger and more visionary with where they currently are at. I did a workshop in I should probably not say that I'm on, you know, like there's probably people that are from here, but I did a workshop in a conventional cropping area, had like 30 people come along, all conventional croppers. And I said, at one point, the question came up of who wants to see their children want to take over the farm? And nobody did. And I was like, seriously, you don't want your kids to be involved? And finally, this big burly guy got up at the back of the room and he said, we have so many inputs. I have so much debt. I don't know what's happening with the climate and I am so stressed. Why would I want my kids to come back to this? Yeah. And it was so impactful for him to say that right at the beginning of a class, because then it really gets people to confront the unworkability of what's currently happening in agriculture and what do you really want and why do we do these things that we do. You know, it's a lot of hard work for not a lot of reward and a lot of stress. What would it be like if we could, you know, relieve some of that stress? So for me, yeah, when facilitating changes in mindset, it's definitely working on that emotional connection.
Cool. Using pigs, mob stocking, mob grazing with pigs. I know there's a couple of people on here that use the pigs within their arable rotation. Will the rooting behaviour of pigs be disruptive to the plants and their root exudation? Yes.
Yeah, pigs can be incredibly destructive, and you know, we ran pigs and we just found, you know, when soils are really wet, they just do so much damage, and that damage can be very long lived. They can create like a hydrophobic type condition. Yeah, so you know, pigs, I guess when it is wet, you need to have some kind of standoff pad and then be managing them when the soil is a bit drier. Yeah, I mean, they're eating all the worms, which is fabulous. You know, they are omnivores. They're after those worms. So, you know, we were putting in diverse crop species like chicory, and the chicory actually seemed to do all right with the pigs. But yeah, they're tricky ones to stack into your enterprise because of the amount of damage, and unless you want to ring them, and I never really wanted to ring mine. But yeah, we were beginning to question that.
Yeah, there is a he might be on the webinar at the moment, but there is a very good pig farmer over here in the UK called and Gothenley Farmer, and he's got a really clever system, and he kind of finishes them within a roundhouse. So he's got that sort of balance between having them outside and being able to manage it better.
Yeah.
So what would you say the first steps you'd sort of recommend taking if moving from an intensive farming model into a regenerative organic model? Because and that sort of is personal to me as well, because down here in Cornwall, that's essentially what I'm going to be doing. And my strategy is basically going to put in a massive cover crop and then graze that for about 5 years.
So what was the question in that? Sorry.
What were the first steps you'd recommend taking from that model?
You need to benchmark. So you need to know what's working well, what's not working as well. Is there a nutrient limitation? You know, is your nitrogen cycle working? You know, this, you know, I have worked with some people who have pulled the rug out of their program and then, you know, substituted with, you know, trace elements or the minerals that are missing. But I think to reduce risk and stress, you really need to be benchmarking very well and figure out, you know, what is happening in terms of soil structure. And so it's really taking a comprehensive look at your soil indicators and your plant health indicators. Yeah, and not just pulling the rug out. Typically, I find I can go on to any intensive operation and drop their inputs by about 30% without any change in yield. So that's often the first step, is things like just tightening up that inefficiency in things like nitrogen and phosphorus through the use of these carbon-based products, and then doing some kind of seed treatment. And so, you know, for a large cropping operation like the ones we work with in Canada and Australia, you know, they could make an additional $1 million a year just through soaking up some of those inefficiencies. So it's I prefer a step-by-step process. Now, can we just pull the rug? Yes, you can, but just be prepared to spend a little bit more money in terms of, trying to overcome whatever you've just pulled out.
And yeah, moving on to cover crops, how would you sort of identify the correct cover crop for your land? Or is it more about sort of what you want to achieve out of it?
Yeah, you need to look at your goals. So what is your specific goal? I don't know about the UK, but there's a really great cover crop calculator here in the US, the Smart Cover Crop Calculator. That's absolutely brilliant. There's a presentation by Peter Barrett on Linburn Station, LINNBURN, that's online, that he has a really comprehensive table that you can pause on and have a look at all the many of the different cover crop species, and in terms of what nutrient limitation are they overcoming, what soil limitation, what are they providing in terms of forage or anything like that. So getting a really comprehensive guide like that to then be able to help your decision-making process. Like, you don't just go and willy-nilly throw in anything and cross your fingers. Like, you really want to go, well, I'm trying to overcome compaction, or actually my nitrogen cycle is broken down, or phosphorus is broken down, or I just need more forage for animals, or whatever. But yeah, getting really clear about why it is that you want a cover crop.
Cool. Just a question about carbon soil content and its loss. Having lost 84% of fertile topsoil, how quickly can our soils sequester that carbon loss? In
temperate environments, we probably have some of the fastest opportunity to do this because, you know, we have fairly regular rainfall. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that's a piece of string question, and I don't work in the UK, so I don't know how fast you can do it in the UK, and there probably is people that could answer that, but I think we have no idea. We just have no idea how fast we can do it. And yeah, I mean, some of my cropping guys, we are building 0.5% to 1% organic matter per year. What would that look like on your place if you're able to do that? I mean, and you know, this is cropping. We're not talking even of livestock. So yeah, what's possible?
Yeah, cool. What do you reckon the top few in-field soil health measurements would be?
I think definitely doing an infiltration test. I like the slaking test. So that's looking at aggregate stability, how well the soils kind of stick together. I think because a lot of you have high clay soils, it might not be as valuable. I use refractometer, so looking at plant bricks. So it's a very easy tool to use. It's very cheap. And we're basically just looking at how well is that plant photosynthesizing, and then, you know, how good can we get it? So a lot of the regenerative guys that I work with, their bricks will be in the high teens, early 20s. So that's like 20% sugar and dissolved solids. Whereas when you go into many conventional operations, or even you test the stuff in the supermarket, you're going to find the bricks is probably between 3 to 5. So very low plant photosynthesis, which then translates to lower production, more animal health issues, more pests, weeds, and diseases. So I really like the refractometer, used it for a long time. In my toolkit, I also have a leaf pH meter, and that's probably more valuable for people that are in horticulture or viticulture, to look at what is going on in terms of the sap pH, because that can tell you a lot of information. And a shovel, I mean a spade, whatever you call it in the UK. Those that, you know, digging holes and using your nose, like really sniffing soils, looking at soil color, using our visual assessments for soil health is probably the best thing you can do, and it's probably one of the least used tools, is just getting a spade out and digging holes. So yeah, that would be that. I do use the soil food web, so a microbiology test, and then the soil test that we use, one of the tests is the Malik test, so looking at what's functional nutritionally, and then what's sitting in your bank account. So taking your soil test to know what's sitting in there, and then plant tissue tests. So we take plant tissue tests to, you could see that maybe a mineral is low in the soil, but if the plant has got adequate to high levels, it doesn't matter. I don't care. I'm not going to go and put a whole lot of money and invest that into phosphate if that plant has adequate phosphate levels. So I get more interested in what's the plant domain, what is that plant experiencing in terms of soil, and yeah, again, looking at those root systems, how deep do your roots go, have they got that Rastafarian rhizosheath?
Yeah, and we've got a really good app over here in the UK as well called Soil, which, you know, it's got some great metrics on that you can do in the field as well as a farmer. Yeah, is it possible to start the regeneration process on degraded land purely with animals?
If management's been your missing link, then yes. So I think there's been some pretty good successes using animals. And it depends how big those areas are that are degraded. I personally I'd like to speed things up. So if I'm using animals, I'm potentially also going to use a probiotic for animals, and I might use a trace element or something that's missing on that soil just to kind of jumpstart it. If you have a large insect pressure, then I might take care with those biocontrols of insects. But if it's degraded land off, you don't want to spend the money. So your best option is livestock grazing, and then reassess after a couple of years and go, all right, are we really bringing life back to these environments? I work a lot with long-term holistic graziers who've been doing this for, say, 30 years and have hit walls because grazing management wasn't their limiting factor, right? If you look at your 5 M's, it might not have been management that was the problem, or the management's probably caused the problem, but then to keep assessing and making sure that we don't just go, oh, okay, I can solve all of this with grazing. But like I said, management's your number one tool. So it could be just you get grazing management going, then awesome. But I've been in situations where grazing isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Adding woody material to soil is generally thought to reduce the amount of nitrogen available to the crop.
Those white woods have a very narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so if you have a pile of those white wood chips, you'll see grass growing thickly right up to the side of it. It's not the same as using pine or eucalyptus. You probably have a lot of eucalypts. So no, we don't necessarily see that robbing of N. If you have maybe a wood that is higher with its carbon to nitrogen ratio, you could add a little bit of molasses or a little bit of fish. But we were applying wood chips at about 10 cubic meters per hectare and not seeing any robbing of nitrogen. In fact, the nitrogen cycle improved.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because there was a discussion on the PFLA forum, and they were talking about using wood chip instead of straw for animal bedding. And there was just a few people on there that were concerned about it, the rate of breaking down.
Well, they're probably using pine though, yeah?
Yeah, I wasn't sure of what they
Often animal bedding is pine. Like that smell, that's all the tannins and the antimicrobials, that's more of a problem than the nitrogen suck. So it's all bioproducts, the volatile organic compounds that are in those strong smelling woods. So they would not be ones that I'd be putting raw onto land.
So could you explain the aerobic and anaerobic bacteria and fungi how they relate to each other? So as some people are feeding anaerobic. Sorry, it keeps moving on me. But yeah, basically the relationship between anaerobic and fungi, I think is what I'm trying to get to.
A lot of your bacteria in soil are actually facultative, which means they can be happy in aerobic or anaerobic conditions. And in fact, when you look at your aggregate structure, you want large aggregates that are actually anaerobic on the inside, and then you've got gas diffusion. So the goal really is to create these anaerobic aerobic pockets. When you get that anaerobic zone inside an aggregate, that's actually where nitrogen fixation happens. So the nitrogen fixing organisms in soil like Azotobacter or Frankia require anaerobic conditions. So yeah, what some people are doing with like the indoory composting method, which is anaerobic, or things like bokashi, which is anaerobic, we still see those organisms providing benefit and stimulating other types of organisms in the soil. You wouldn't want to put too much on, obviously, but if you allow it to go through that aerobic phase, then that's going to be beneficial. Yeah, so I'm not in either camp. I mean, I think if you're doing compost teas and stuff like that, it needs to be highly aerobic. Most of your disease organisms are anaerobic. So when we get a whole lot of those compacted layers, or you get those smells and the sulfur reducing organisms, like that's not good. We don't want to ever see that happening in a soil situation. So it's about gas diffusion and aggregate stability.
How do we deal with cow slurry?
Like in the pit, so we're talking about
Slurry lagoon, yeah. So there's because of the, I guess the housing of the dairy cows, it's because it's slightly different to the New Zealand system, but there's a lot of slurry produced in these systems.
Yeah, so we make like a lactobacillus that we spray down in the barns. So it's sprayed, you know, on the floors and on the walls, and when you wash down, that we're putting microbiology out into those slurry systems. And what's good about that lactobacillus is it also eats those ammonia forming organisms, so we don't get that ammonia in dairy systems, and we can get rid of that in about 40 minutes. It's super cool. And you can make your own lactobacillus from milk, and I think it's on my website is how to make it. But yeah, using these different types of dairy digesters, there's a lot of biological products on the market. I also like putting humate into my settling ponds so that we get that chelation process, that breakdown process, and just really stimulate the microbiology to get hold of stuff. But yeah, you really do need to be biologically pre-treating before stuff goes out, and especially because you're probably using like a lot of disinfectants and things that can kill microbiology, you need to just keep topping it up.
Cool.
But don't put it on raw.
No.
Stop putting it on raw.
As people transition from a chemical base to regenerative, how accurate are the worries around years of low yield as they transition?
I've just never had that experience. I think that happened with people pulling the rug out, with not addressing what their major limiting factors are, without kind of looking at, well, what is happening with airflow? You try and just transition and you have a soil that's seriously compacted, your nitrogen cycle is not going to work. And so if you're not putting nitrogen on, you're going to see a big yield. And I think, you know, it's kind of what gave organic a bad name to start with, was just the pulling of the rug. Don't do that. You need to figure out what's not working as well as it needs to, and then how do we wean ourselves off without a drop in yield. I call it the methadone program, but don't tell anybody, you know, like how do we go off that system without putting the system into shock?
Yeah. Do you think that the circular economy of food waste could help build back soil nutrient content?
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID's really highlighted the inefficiencies and breakdown of our food system, that really we have an overproduction of food. It's just not evenly distributed. And then we have the amount of, I don't know what the food waste is in the UK, but here in the US it's just massive. I mean, it's probably a third of all the food producers just wasted. So yeah, if that was being turned into good quality compost or vermicast, or yeah, used for energy, then I think that would be fantastic. So yeah, I mean, I think we need more investment into that space, and then we need to stop wasting food.
Do you recommend an aerating machine equipment to aerate compact anoxic soils prior to sowing with deep rooting crops to encourage the,
Yeah, it's going to really fast track. And I think anytime we're using machinery, we're also going to be thinking, how do I feed my underground livestock? How do I feed microbiology? So if we are ripping, or we're going to drip, if we're going to drill, then we're going to put some kind of biological foods down. And when I talk about some, I'm talking like maybe a liter of a humic acid and 250 mils of molasses, like tiny amounts that we're going to drip down those aerations or down the rips. Otherwise, they just seal up again because you haven't addressed why have you got compaction to start with, and you want to get really curious about that. You know, the 5 M's again. Is it a mineral balance? Is it a microbial thing? Is it my management? Is it me? And really take a look at that to long-term address your compaction. But we find with most of our dairy farm clients is that we're coming in with an aerator year 1 because that is their major limiting factor. Their nitrogen cycle, phosphorus won't be working until that's addressed. And then, yeah, put foods down with it. I mean, you see some of these deep-rooted cover crops, like they're going to save the day, and what you'll find is they'll actually grow up above ground, or they'll grow sideways, and they're still not really taking care of your problem. I do find oats is a really good crop to help address some of these compaction issues because of its real fibrous root, and it's a pretty cheap plant to kind of put in, and it also stimulates mycorrhizae, so it puts a lot of spores in the ground. So oats can be a really helpful crop.
Okay, interesting. Is tilling or breaking up the soil ever a good idea, or do we always need to have soil cover?
I don't think I've ever recommended tillage. It takes a very long time for a soil system to recover from tillage. You know, that it's hugely disruptive. I have got one soil at the moment that is like one of the most degraded soils I've ever seen in my life, and it's got about 1 inch of thatch on top and totally water repellent. Big pH difference between that top layer and below, and I think that's probably I think they are gonna lightly disc that just to break up that water repellency. But no, I'm not a big fan of tillage.
What do you think of using human manure as a source for compost?
I just go back to that last question. If you look in the book, there's a chapter in there on River Sun. So they are an intensive rootstock nursery, and they are cultivating. They want a very fine tilth, and you can look at what we did to repair that cultivation event so that they are still maintaining or building soil carbon, they're feeding microbiology. So there's things that we can do if we are going to cultivate. Yeah, so if you are cultivating, then there are positive things that you can do. Right, so human manure, I will never use it because it has human pharmaceuticals, the female pill, and heavy metals and stuff in it that if you're putting that on your land, it's going to take a really long time for you to remediate that. Worms won't process the human pill. Most microbiology don't know what to do with pharmaceuticals. The only thing I've seen that sort of seems to remediate human manure is biochar. And then who knows how long? Like, is that something you're just putting that problem out into, you know, for your great grandkids to deal with? So yeah, until the human race tidies up their diet and the pharmaceuticals they're taking, I won't be using human manure. But yeah, if you're doing this at home and you're not on any drugs and pills or anything like that, then by all means, you know, it's probably a great product. The Chinese used it for thousands of years. Yeah.
Okay. Do you ever recommend the use of a keyline plough?
Yes. Yeah, in some of these semi-arid environments, we are using a keyline. Make sure you are following the contours. One of my favorite properties is Jillamatong, Jillamatong. Jillamatong is based in Braidwood, just out of Canberra in Australia. You want to Google them. You want to look at what they're doing. And same with Maloon Creek, that are doing a lot of. They've just got some funding from the Australian government to restore an entire catchment, and yeah, that keyline plough would be part of it, creating leaky weirs, you know, just really looking at how do we slow water through the environment. So yeah, in these semi-arid environments, what we find, you know, I'm here in Idaho or Montana is, you know, there's a whole lot of snow that they get, and then it melts and it's all gone. And it's like, there's no water slowing mechanisms here. And so, yeah, sometimes I think it's worth investing in something like a keyline. And there are keyline plows here in the US that people can borrow.
Do you have any additional tips beyond what you've talked about on building soil and improving root structure on solid chalk?
Yeah, and I've I haven't worked on chalk, but I've worked on like just calcium carbonate limestone soils, you know, and they can be real resources. I mean, you can build some beautiful dark soils on them. Again, it's about supporting that plant to develop that rhizosheath, so it's not dealing with a dramatic change in pH. So that plant, you might have a pH of 9, but in that rhizosheath, that plant's experiencing 7. So by doing seed treatments, we can fast track trying to break through and start to get integration of different types of subsoil materials or whatever. But yeah.
So what sort of seed treatment would that be?
I would do like a worm extract or a fungal compost extract, and put that onto the seed. And that Webinar that I talked about, I think we get into some of those practical applications on that.
What practical steps can you take to improve the fungal bacterial ratio in soils? Number
1 is probably to stop killing your fungi. So figure out, why is your fungi not as active as it could be? Are you using some kind of pesticides or fungicides? You know, getting the neonicotinoids off seeds. Are they legal in the UK?
I don't think so.
Oh, well, that's good. That's very good news. Well done, UK.
I don't know. I'm an organic farmer, so I don't know.
So yeah, making sure we don't have those types of materials, so pesticides and fungicides on seeds to start with too. And then feeding fungi, so often longer residuals, animal impacts, so trampling material, allowing plants to get to that reproductive phase. We're not kind of maintaining them at level 2, at stage 2 rather, where you're just keeping them in that vegetative phase. So if you're just grazing and it's always vegetative, then you need to find another way to feed fungi, because that green stuff is not going to stimulate fungi in the same way. But yeah, those humates, complex foods, wood chips.
Perfect. For arable farmers thinking of introducing grazing livestock, do you think low stocking rates would be as effective as building soil as the high ones?
No, it depends. It depends if you're doing damage with high stocking rates. I mean, that's the balance that you're trying to work with, is not doing too much damage. But certainly, it's not so much about your stocking rate, it's more about rest and recovery. So allowing plants to adequately recover, so you can have a lower stocking rate, but you're still getting impact. Yeah, it's making sure that you are getting adequate impact, basically. And obviously you're going to be able to do that with higher stocking rates if you've got the land.
Yeah. As a dairy farmer running a kiwi system, grass only, no concentrates, how do I transition my herd into a mob grazing system without losing cow performance, loss of milk solids?
Really good question.
Lower ME in the grass, yeah.
Really good. So the kiwi system has a lot of concentrates, by the way. So New Zealanders use an awful lot of PKU. So yeah, it's not a kiwi system. We're doing better than a kiwi system. So yeah, it's a good question, because what we find is that question around metabolizable energy or relative feed quality is around microbiology. And so I work with dairy farmers that are on tall grass grazing systems. That's probably mid-Fi. I mean, incredible diversity in there. So it's making sure you're getting diversity of your sward. It's making sure that you're getting biology functional before you start to lengthen those rotations, because it's fungi that actually change the quality of the pasture that you're growing. They change the quality of the pectins that are being produced. And so we end up with what typically would have been considered rank. I don't know if you call it rank in the UK. Rank. That like lower metabolizable energy, the tall stuff. If we have microbiology that are functional, we don't see that loss in production. So these tall grass grazing guys in New Zealand would have the same, if not higher production. Some of them have cut cow numbers back, but they're still producing the same amount of milk. So they might have gone from 850 cows to 700 cows, and they're still producing the same amount of milk. On longer rotations, but it's because they're focused on really feeding diverse microbiology, getting your fungi working, getting soil structure working, and so then the quality is maintained. So the idea of rank or low ME on taller pastures is in conventional systems. And in the conventional system, that's true. But once we start to work with microbiology and we get quality coming through the sward, then we find those rules go out the window.
Yeah, and just with that diversity, I mean, if you're running a sort of a ryegrass monoculture, it's going to be very different to a very diverse sort of herbal layer, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, we want it as diverse as possible and be making sure that we're really supporting animal health and performance.
Yeah. Here's one. I'm a home gardener. Can you give me advice on a very small scale? E.g., cover crops don't really apply in the same way, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, they do. You know, everything that we're talking about can be applied on a little scale to a large scale, and you've got more opportunity. So, you know, making your own fungal compost, vermicast, getting diversity in there, not planting, oh, I'm going to plant, I don't know, tomatoes, and all you plant is tomatoes from wild. So looking at interstory planting, or like the three sisters with your corn and your whatever, brain's gone, pumpkin, squash, corn, squash, and beans, you know, like just really looking at how do I push diversity. And so your gardens can start looking really scraggly because you've got all this diversity in there instead of clean, sharp lines. It's really the monocultures that have caused the problem on industrial scale to, you know, garden scale, is, you know, trying to have everything in this uniform, lined up monocultures.
With the talking of monocultures, with maize, is there a way that you can grow maize so that it's not so damaging in terms of sort of companion planting or undersowing?
Yeah, companion planting, undersowing. You guys have some projects in the UK working on this right now. If you look at a guy called Lawrence Steinlage, Steinlage, who's in Iowa, he actually has permanent, like 8 years of permanent clover that he's planting corn into, which is really cool. And yeah, looking at timings to get, you know, it's a crop that really does work well with intercropping. So, I mean, there's so many research stations over here in the US now that are looking at intercropping with corn and seeing even on greater spacings, they're still getting the same yield because they're getting higher yield per plant. And then you could have another crop that either you're harvesting or you're grazing. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I don't think corn's the problem. I mean, corn's such a big feeder. It's more the
way it's grown.
That's the problem.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue over here. So if you had, if you're going into an existing ryegrass sward and you wanted to establish more diversity, so a diverse lay, how would you terminate the ryegrass?
We kind of talked about that before, didn't we? So yeah, if you wanted to spray, so I would drop my herbicide by 30% and add in 1 part fulvic acid. That's FULVIC. Fulvic acid to 4 or 5 parts herbicide, and just, yeah, that'll take your ryegrass out. Or, you know, I mean, ryegrass is such a persistent, you know, but it's, you know, it's a growing plant, so that's good. But yeah, you want your cover crop to get away, so knocking it back, grazing back. If your subsequent planting didn't establish, you need to figure out why. Yeah.
Cool. And in terms of metrics for soil health, what would you consider the most important to be?
All of them.
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, and again, it comes to, well, your metric might be slightly different because you've got a different limitation. I mean, out here in Idaho, it's going to be organic matter. It's going to be what's happening with soil carbon, nitrogen, infiltration. Yeah, so for you guys, some of you really have compaction problems, then looking at what is happening with water infiltration or bulk density to really show like we're lifting it. But at the end of the day, it is the outcome. So, you know, are you producing more nutrient dense? What are you producing? If that's corn or beef, are you testing that? Do you know what the nutrient density is right now and how good can you get it? this ranch I'm on right now is Older Spring Ranch. I really recommend you guys look it up. Amazing. And they've had some researchers looking at what's happening in their meat in terms of anti-inflammatory properties. So what is it that this meat, what is it giving to people, consumers, when they eat it? And so they're measuring anti-inflammatories, and they compared it to the Impossible Burger. And what they found was their beef is right up in the top right of all these anti-inflammatory properties for human health, and the Impossible Burger was all in the bottom left of inflammatory agents. So thinking about how we can be talking about what we're producing in terms of this is food for humans to sustain human health and well-being, as opposed to McDonald's.
Fair enough. On a permanent pasture, what advice do you have on when to move livestock off the grass to maintain optimum recovery, and when would you allow them back on the pasture? And yeah, I'd be intrigued too about this high utilization versus low utilization.
Again, it depends on your goals and then how long you're going to take to come back. So, you know, there's that take a third, leave a third, trample a third kind of mentality. You know, and we're always looking for prescriptions, but it's very complex, and it's going to depend on the time of year, and it's going to depend on the type of species, because what is adequate recovery for a ryegrass to, I don't know what some of your native perennials might be. Like, you know, are we looking for the 5-leaf stage where adequate recovery is that that 5th leaf is touching the ground? Or is it the length of that node? So it's not height, it's looking at how many leaves does a plant have, depending on the species, all right? Because it's going to be very different for couch grass, or I don't know what you guys grow, right? But so yeah, it's knowing what is the recovery for that plant, you know. And every so often, I don't have a problem with taking every blade of grass, but we're going to have a really good long recovery on that, and it's going to depend on the time of year that we're taking every blade of grass. You know, and if you're taking every blade, you want to be doing that when that plant is more dormant. You know, you can get away with a bit more murder, let's say, like in the middle of winter, but you might be too wet to do that, or the middle of summer when things really aren't growing. You're going to do less damage than continuing to graze and keep taking that new growth that's coming through in the plant. So it's very much about how long are you in a pasture, and then how long can you stay off to allow that to recover. And I find most people do not have enough pasture, like individual pastures. They're not running their mobs together. So really having more flexibility in the number of pastures that you have, and being able to put everything together as much as you can so that you can lengthen that recovery time is key. And also making sure that we're managing animal performance in this. So I've seen some ranches here that might restrict and aim for, they want high animal impact to deal with some kind of issue. Maybe it's weeds or, you know, a lot of rank grass or something. You might do that for a day, and then you allow 5 days where they've got more space and more, or 3 days, let's say, in the UK situation, where you've got more space for them to choose, and then you'll constrict them again. And then when you come back, you're going to miss that on your next rotation. So just having all this kind of adaptability and flexibility in our grazing, and knowing, you know, this is where the observation and the art really comes into it. Like, grazing really is an artful art. And, you know, speaking now from not owning my own property for 5 years and not doing the grazing, is really, you know, watching and working with people who are incredible artisans. So the Older Spring Ranch example, we're really looking at grazing, probably only taking 25% of plants and then not coming back for 1 or 2 years. And that's totally appropriate for these landscapes. But in the UK, you know, 90 days might be too long a recovery. So it's knowing your own specific plants and your weather patterns. But we certainly see, like what's happening in New Zealand at the moment, you know, we've had a pretty major drought, is that New Zealanders are not prepared for drought. They don't have that stockpiled forage. They don't have that forage ahead of them, and starting to think, worst case scenario, what if it dries up? What if we don't get rain for 3 months? Would you be able to continue to graze through that and not be overgrazing? So yeah, that root recovery, if you're taking more than 70% of that plant, it can take 117 days for those plants to even restart forming roots again. So yeah, like I said, there's a lot of art to it.
Perfect. And just to finish up, this is quite an interesting one. Do you think a regen certification standard is required to enable consumers to support regen farmers? Or even just honest, maybe?
I think if it was based on outcomes, so we're seeing the EOV paddock to plate one that the Savory Institute's driving, so ecological outcome verification. I think if we have a certification that's based on outcomes, I think that would be great. Yeah, and I think it's going to help inform decisions, I mean, consumer decisions, and we're going to see the greenwashing of this stuff really fast. I saw a question before about Cargill, you know, and it's like, if Cargill are involved in this, is that going to start greenwashing? And, you know, it is very much a concern of mine. But what we're seeing is, you know, we're in a hugely innovative space right now, and I wouldn't want to see any certification that's based on dogma or on practices. It needs to be very much be about outcomes. Are you improving every year, improving the outcomes for your land and water quality and greenhouse gases? And doing a certification like that is not going to be very cheap, because you're going to have to put your money where your mouth is and be testing those things. But I think with an educated consumer, you could be getting the premiums if that's what you wanted. But I also think, like, I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in this when you're not spending all that money on inputs and on animal health.
Yeah, yeah. Brilliant. Well, that's pretty much time. Thanks, Nicole. That was absolutely amazing.
No worries.
Yeah, that was really, really cool. And yeah, we're going to record this and put it back on YouTube so people can refer back to it. But no, thank you. And great stuff.
These are quite funny comments. We do inches and acres. We invented them. Pounds ago, so. Yeah, Canadians, you can speak in multiple languages. Yeah, and the questions about the webinar. I think if you just Google webinar Nicole Masters, then that should come up on YouTube. It should be on my website too. So I've got a resources page on integritysoils.co.nz that has yeah, some video resources. So yeah, I think the webinar might be on there. It should be on that. If not, I hope to put it on there.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for your really great questions, and thanks to PFLA for organising this. Thanks, Tim. It's really good to see you again. And yeah.
On different sides of the world this time.
Yeah. 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 And it's pretty. It's really hot here now. I'm gonna find somewhere cold.
Brilliant.
All right. Have a good day or good night.
You.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.